Ryan Mitchell had prepared for many things during his diplomatic training: cultural misunderstandings, translation errors, and the occasional ceremonial meal that might involve foods that technically qualified as still alive. What he hadn't prepared for was elder matriarch Seraphine calmly explaining that according to Theavani law, he was now required to marry 3 alien women before his visa expired. "I'm sorry," Ryan said, his brain struggling to process the information while maintaining the professional composure that his diplomatic corps training insisted was essential during even the most surreal cultural exchanges. "Could you repeat that last part? I think my universal translator might be malfunctioning." The elder matriarch's luminescent markings pulsed with what Ryan was beginning to recognize as barely contained amusement. "According to the sacred protocols of alliance, every human male who sets foot on Theavani soil must enter into marriage bonds with 3 of our women to demonstrate commitment to interspecies cooperation and secure the political stability necessary for meaningful diplomatic relations." Ryan looked around the Crystal Council chamber, noting that the assembled Theavani officials were watching his reaction with the focused attention of beings evaluating a particularly interesting specimen. The 3 women who'd been introduced as his potential bond partners sat in positions of obvious authority, their expressions ranging from diplomatic professionalism to what might have been sympathetic understanding. "When you say must," Ryan began carefully, "are we talking about a strong cultural recommendation, or more of a violate this law and spend the rest of your short life in an alien prison situation?" "The latter," replied Counselor Lyra, a striking woman whose silver hair seemed to catch and reflect the chamber's crystalline light, while her pointed ears framed features that could have graced classical sculptures if classical sculptors had specialized in subjects who could probably kill you 17 different ways. "Though the marriages serve practical purposes beyond cultural tradition." Practical purposes: access to strategic alliance networks, refugee protection protocols, and military coordination systems that span 12-star systems, said Counselor Myra, whose luminescent markings pulsed with patterns that Ryan's cultural briefings had identified as indicating intense intellectual focus. "The bond of 3 grants authority over evacuation corridors and diplomatic immunity that extends to entire populations." And, added Counselor Zara, whose violet eyes held depths that suggested she was always thinking several moves ahead of everyone else in the room, "control over the crystal mining operations that your Earth Confederation desperately wants access to for your new space drive technology." Ryan felt his simple cultural liaison assignment transforming into something considerably more complex. "So you're saying that my routine diplomatic mission has accidentally turned into a marriage proposal that affects interstellar military strategy and mining rights?" "Accidentally." Elder Matriarch Seraphine's markings shifted to patterns that Ryan suspected indicated amusement. "Mr. Mitchell, your assignment to Theavana Prime was specifically requested by our council after extensive review of your psychological profile, diplomatic record, and compatibility assessments with our cultural values." Compatibility assessments. "The bond of 3 requires more than political convenience," Lyra explained, her tone growing serious. "The partnerships must be genuine, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to protecting refugee populations and maintaining interspecies peace." Ryan studied the 3 women who were apparently his designated wives, noting details that his diplomatic training flagged as significant. Lyra's bearing suggested military authority. Myra's focus on refugee protection indicated humanitarian priorities, and Zara's mention of mining operations suggested technical expertise that would be invaluable for the trade negotiations he'd been sent to facilitate. "Not to be rude," he said, "but on Earth, marriage typically involves significantly fewer participants and considerably more courtship time than surprise. You're now responsible for 12 star systems worth of refugee protection. Earth marriage customs are charmingly simple, Myra said with a smile that suggested she found human relationship conventions endearingly primitive. Theavani bonds are designed around practical necessities and emotional compatibility rather than romantic idealization. Emotional compatibility, Ryan repeated, determined how exactly? 3-month trial period, Zara replied matter-of-factly. If the partnerships prove incompatible, the bonds can be dissolved without diplomatic consequences. If they prove successful, the formal ceremonies activate access to systems that could save millions of lives. Ryan looked around the chamber again, noting that the conversation had the feel of a carefully orchestrated presentation, rather than a spontaneous cultural exchange. You've been planning this for some time. The border wars have displaced over 2 million refugees, Elder Matriarch Seraphine said, her luminescent markings shifting to patterns that conveyed the weight of massive responsibility. Our evacuation systems can relocate them to safety, but only with alliance bonds that grant access to protected corridors through human space. And those bonds require a human partner. They require a human partner who understands that some responsibilities transcend personal preferences, Lyra said quietly. Someone willing to accept authority over life-and-death decisions affecting entire populations. Ryan felt the weight of expectation settling around him like an expensive and very complicated diplomatic uniform. What happens if I say no? Then 2 million refugees remain trapped in border zones that will be overrun by hegemony forces within the next few weeks, Myra replied with brutal honesty. And Earth loses access to crystal technology that could revolutionize your space exploration capabilities. And if I say yes, then you become one of the most powerful humans in known space, with authority over military systems you don't understand, responsibility for populations you've never met, and marriage bonds with 3 women whose cultural expectations you're still learning to navigate, Zara said, with a grin that suggested she found the situation more amusing than daunting. Ryan walked to the chamber's viewing portal, looking out at the floating crystal cities that stretched toward Theavana Prime's purple sky. In the distance, he could see transport ships arriving with what appeared to be refugee populations, their numbers suggesting the scope of the crisis was even larger than the Council had indicated. How long do I have to decide? The hegemony advance forces reach the outer refugee settlements in 72 hours, Lyra said. The evacuation corridors require 48 hours to activate once the bond of 3 is formalized. So I have 24 hours to decide whether to accidentally become a polygamist in order to save 2 million refugees and gain access to crystal technology that could change the balance of power in human space. Essentially, yes. Ryan turned back to face the 3 women who were apparently waiting to become his wives, noting that their expressions suggested they understood the impossible situation he'd been placed in, and weren't entirely unsympathetic to his obvious confusion. Well, he said finally, this definitely wasn't covered in my diplomatic training manual. Though I have to ask, what exactly did Earth Command tell you about my qualifications for accidentally becoming responsible for interstellar refugee operations? They said you were stubborn enough to argue with impossible bureaucracy, competent enough to handle complex logistics, and decent enough to put people's survival ahead of your own convenience, Myra replied. Also, that you had experience with emergency evacuation procedures, and a talent for improvising solutions when normal protocols failed. That's actually a fairly accurate assessment. Which is why, Elder Matriarch Seraphine said with satisfaction, we believe the bond of 3 will prove successful for all parties involved. As Ryan looked at the alien women who might become his wives and the refugee crisis that required his decision, he realized that his simple liaison assignment had just become the most important choice he'd ever make. The question was whether he was ready to accept responsibility for millions of lives in exchange for relationships he couldn't fully understand with people whose expectations he was still learning to navigate. The guest quarters assigned to Ryan looked like they'd been designed by someone who understood that diplomatic visitors might need time to process life-changing information, while surrounded by beauty that didn't quite follow human aesthetic principles. Crystal formations grew from the walls in patterns that seemed to respond to emotional states, while viewing portals showed landscapes that shifted between reality and artistic interpretation, depending on the observer's mental state. The architectural psychology is fascinating, Ryan muttered to himself, examining walls that appeared to be actively monitoring his stress levels. Though I'm not sure having my living space adjust to my emotional state is helping with the whole processing impossible marriage proposals situation. A soft chime indicated an incoming communication, and Counselor Lyra's image materialized in the room's center with holographic clarity that made Earth's communication technology look like amateur theater. Mr. Mitchell, I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I thought you might have questions about the practical aspects of the bond of three. Actually, I have several thousand questions, starting with how exactly three-person marriages function on a day-to-day basis, and ending with whether Earth Command knew about this marriage law when they assigned me to Theavana Prime. Lyra's expression suggested she'd been expecting exactly these questions. Earth Command was informed of the marriage requirements during initial diplomatic contact. They chose not to include that information in your briefing materials. They chose not to mention that accepting this assignment would require me to get married. They believed you would decline the assignment if you knew about the marriage protocols in advance. They also believed that once you understood the scope of the refugee crisis, you would accept the responsibilities regardless of personal inconvenience. Ryan sat down heavily in a chair that immediately adjusted its configuration to provide optimal comfort, while displaying subtle light patterns that seemed designed to reduce anxiety. So Earth Command deliberately sent me here under false pretenses, knowing I'd be legally required to marry 3 alien women to complete my mission. Your superiors appear to have an accurate understanding of your character, Lyra said with something that might have been approval. The mission briefing materials indicated that you consistently prioritize humanitarian concerns over personal preferences when making difficult decisions. Humanitarian concerns, Ryan repeated. Right. Speaking of which, can you explain how exactly three-person marriages work in practical terms? Because human relationship dynamics are complicated enough with two people. Theavani partnerships are built around complementary responsibilities rather than exclusive romantic attachment, Lyra explained, her tone shifting to something more personal. Each bond serves different functions: military alliance, refugee protection, and resource management, while maintaining emotional connections based on mutual respect and shared values. So it's like having 3 specialized partnerships instead of one comprehensive marriage. Exactly, though the emotional bonds often develop beyond their initial practical purposes. Lyra's luminescent markings shifted to patterns that Ryan's cultural database identified as indicating personal honesty. The trial period exists precisely to determine whether genuine affection can develop alongside political necessity. Ryan studied her expression, noting details that suggested this conversation was more than just diplomatic briefing. What's your opinion of the situation? Not as a counselor, but as someone who might end up married to a confused human who's still trying to figure out basic Theavani social customs. My honest opinion. Lyra's smile held warmth that transformed her from diplomatic official to someone considerably more appealing. I think Earth Command chose well. Your psychological profile suggests someone capable of adapting to complex situations while maintaining moral integrity. Your emergency response experience indicates competence under pressure, and your reaction to learning about the marriage requirements suggests someone who prioritizes others' welfare over personal convenience. My reaction was mostly panic and confusion. Your reaction was to ask about the practical implications for refugee populations before asking about the personal implications for yourself. That suggests exactly the kind of character we need in a bond partner. Another communication chime interrupted their conversation, and Counselor Myra's image joined the holographic display. Ryan, I hope you don't mind my joining the conversation. I wanted to discuss the refugee protection aspects of the bond. Actually, I'd appreciate that, because I'm still trying to understand how my marriage status affects the survival of 2 million displaced people. The ancient alliance systems require genetic authorization from bonded partners of different species, Myra explained, activating displays that showed evacuation route networks spanning multiple star systems. Without human genetic codes in the authorization matrix, the corridors remain locked regardless of political agreements or military necessity. Ryan studied the evacuation routes, his emergency response training automatically analyzing the logistics involved. These corridor systems, they're not just transportation networks, are they? They're complete evacuation infrastructures with life support, medical facilities, and temporary housing for massive populations. Built by our ancestors who understood that sometimes entire civilizations need to relocate quickly, Myra confirmed. But they also understood that such powerful systems require safeguards to prevent abuse. The bonding requirements ensure that evacuation decisions are made by individuals with personal investment in interspecies cooperation. Personal investment, Ryan said slowly. You mean the marriage bonds ensure that whoever controls the evacuation systems has emotional connections to multiple species, making them less likely to use the systems for conquest rather than humanitarian purposes. Precisely. The bond of three creates shared responsibility that transcends political convenience or military advantage. A third communication chime brought Counselor Zara into the conversation, her violet eyes reflecting the chamber's crystalline light as her image joined the others. I hope I'm not interrupting important strategic discussions with mundane concerns about crystal mining operations. Actually, Ryan said, I'd like to understand all aspects of this situation, because apparently my marriage status will affect interstellar trade agreements along with refugee protection and military alliances. The crystal formations that power your new space drives can only be safely extracted using Theovani bioresonance techniques, Zara explained. Techniques that require genetic bonding between human and Theovani operators to prevent catastrophic resonance cascades. Catastrophic resonance cascades. The crystals are essentially living geological formations. Improper extraction kills them and tends to take large portions of surrounding landscape with them. Zara's expression grew serious. Previous attempts by non-bonded extraction teams resulted in explosions equivalent to small nuclear devices. Ryan looked at the three women whose images surrounded him, each representing aspects of an incredibly complex situation that made his original trade negotiation assignment look like elementary diplomacy. So the bond of three isn't just about marriage customs or political alliances. It's about creating the specific genetic and emotional connections needed to safely operate systems that could save millions of lives or destroy entire planets if handled incorrectly. The marriage bonds serve practical purposes that happen to require genuine emotional investment, Lyra summarized. Ancient Theovani technology was designed around the principle that the most dangerous capabilities should only be accessible to individuals whose personal relationships guarantee responsible use. And you believe I'm capable of handling that level of responsibility. We believe you're capable of growing into that level of responsibility, Myra said gently. with appropriate support and partnership from individuals who understand the systems involved. Support and partnership, Ryan repeated, from 3 wives whose cultural expectations I'm still learning to understand. From 3 partners whose primary concern is ensuring that powerful systems are used to protect people rather than exploit them, Zara corrected. The cultural expectations are negotiable. The moral requirements are not. Ryan stood and walked to the viewing portal, looking out at the refugee ships arriving in steadily increasing numbers. The scope of the crisis was becoming clear. This wasn't just about 2 million displaced people, but about establishing precedents for how human and Theovani technology could be combined to address humanitarian crises that span star systems. How long do I have to think about this? As long as you need, Lyra said quietly, though the evacuation deadlines remain unchanged. Right. Save 2 million refugees, gain access to revolutionary technology, and accidentally become responsible for military systems that could reshape the balance of power in 3 star systems. All by getting married to 3 women I met yesterday. When you put it like that, Zara said with a grin, it does sound rather overwhelming. Overwhelming, Ryan agreed, but not impossible. As the 3 holographic images faded and left him alone with his thoughts, Ryan realized that his decision wasn't really about marriage customs or diplomatic protocols. It was about whether he was willing to accept responsibility for capabilities that could either save civilizations or destroy them, depending on how they were used, and whether he was brave enough to trust 3 alien women whose obvious competence and growing appeal suggested that the bond of 3 might offer possibilities he'd never imagined when he'd accepted what he'd thought was a simple liaison assignment. Ryan's second day on Theovana Prime began with emergency alarms that made his diplomatic quarters' soothing crystal formations shift to urgent warning patterns. The holographic communication system activated before he was fully awake, showing Counselor Lyra in what appeared to be a military command center, with displays indicating massive ship movements on the system's outer boundaries. Ryan, we need you in the Strategic Operations Center immediately, Lyra said, her luminescent markings pulsing with patterns that his crash course in Theovani emotional indicators identified as controlled urgency. The Hegemony Advance Forces have accelerated their timeline. How accelerated? Ryan asked, pulling on the formal diplomatic attire that had been provided, clothing that seemed to adjust itself to fit perfectly while displaying status indicators he didn't yet understand. They'll reach the outer refugee settlements in 18 hours instead of 72. The evacuation corridors require a minimum of 24 hours to initialize once the bond of 3 is activated. Ryan felt his stomach drop as the mathematical impossibility of the situation became clear. So, unless we complete the marriage ceremony immediately, the evacuation system won't be ready in time to save the refugee populations. That's the technical reality, yes, though there are political complications that make immediate bonding challenging. The Strategic Operations Center turned out to be a spherical chamber where holographic displays showed real-time tactical information from across 12 star systems. Counselors Myra and Zara were coordinating refugee transport logistics while monitoring hegemony fleet movements, their efficiency suggesting they'd been managing impossible crisis situations for far longer than Ryan had been aware of the problem. The good news, Myra said without looking up from displays showing evacuation capacity calculations, is that our transport network can handle the refugee volume if the corridors activate successfully. The bad news is that Palace Advisor Thane Korath has formally challenged the bonding on ground that humans are psychologically unsuited for alliance responsibilities. Palace Advisor who now? Korath represents the traditional faction that opposes human involvement in Theovani strategic systems, Zara explained, highlighting political indicators that showed growing opposition within the council. He's arguing that your species lacks the emotional stability required for safe operation of evacuation technologies. Based on what evidence? Mostly prejudice and political positioning, Lyra said grimly. Though he's also received support from Earth hardliners, who are demanding you reject the marriage bonds to avoid contaminating human genetic purity. Ryan stared at the displays showing refugee populations in immediate danger, while politicians from both species argued about genetic purity and psychological suitability. So while 2 million people are about to be overrun by hostile forces, we're dealing with xenophobic bureaucrats who think marriage customs are more important than humanitarian crises. Unfortunately, yes. The bonding ceremony requires formal council approval, and Korath has enough political support to delay the proceedings beyond the evacuation deadline. What about emergency protocols? Surely there are provisions for activating the evacuation system during military crises. The emergency protocols, Myra said quietly, require unanimous consent from all bonded partners, which means the three of us would need to activate the systems without formal council approval, accepting personal responsibility for any consequences. What kind of consequences? If the evacuation succeeds, we become heroes who saved millions of lives through decisive action, Zara replied. If anything goes wrong, if the systems malfunction, if refugees are harmed during transport, if the hegemony interprets our actions as military aggression, we face charges of treason, unauthorized use of strategic weapons, and crimes against galactic peace. Ryan looked around the command center, noting that the three women were watching his reaction with expressions that mixed hope with resignation. You're asking me to agree to a marriage bond that could result in all of us being executed for treason if the evacuation doesn't go perfectly. We're asking you to help us save 2 million people regardless of the political risks, Lyra said simply, because sometimes the right choice isn't the safe choice. Ryan studied the tactical displays, his emergency response training automatically analyzing the evacuation logistics and timeline constraints. Show me the technical specifications for the corridor systems. If I'm going to risk treason charges, I want to understand exactly what we're dealing with. The next several hours passed in intensive technical briefings that revealed the true scope of Theavani evacuation technology. The corridor systems weren't just transportation networks. They were mobile habitats that could sustain entire populations during extended relocations, complete with medical facilities, educational systems, and agricultural capabilities that approached the complexity of small planets. These systems, Ryan said, studying power requirements that exceeded anything in human engineering, they're not just evacuation tools. They're civilization preservation protocols, complete societal backup systems, built by ancestors who understood that sometimes survival requires the ability to relocate entire cultures without losing their essential characteristics, Myra confirmed, but also built with safeguards to ensure they're only used for preservation, not conquest. And the safeguards require interspecies bonding to prevent abuse. The systems respond to emotional resonance patterns that can only be achieved through genuine partnership between different species, Zara explained. Artificial bonds or political convenience marriages won't generate the resonance signatures needed for activation. Ryan looked at the three women who'd been selected as his potential partners, seeing not just political figures, but individuals whose competence, dedication, and obvious care for refugee populations represented everything he'd hoped to find in his diplomatic career. The emotional resonance requirements, he said slowly. They're not just about genetic compatibility or political alliance. They're about actual emotional connection. The systems were designed by people who understood that the most powerful technologies should only be accessible to individuals whose personal relationships guarantee they'll use that power responsibly, Lyra said. The bond of three works because it creates emotional investment that transcends political calculation. And you believe we can develop that kind of emotional connection under these circumstances? I believe, Myra said with a smile that transformed her from crisis coordinator to someone considerably more appealing, that emotional connections often develop most strongly when people work together to accomplish something larger than themselves. Besides, Zara added with a grin, your reaction to learning about the marriage requirements suggests someone whose emotional priorities align remarkably well with Theavani values. Most humans would be asking about personal benefits or political advantages. You've been asking about refugee protection and system safety protocols. Ryan looked at the evacuation timeline countdown, showing less than 12 hours before hegemony forces reached the refugee settlements. Then at the political displays showing continued opposition to formal bonding ceremonies. Then at the three women whose obvious competence and growing appeal suggested that accepting their partnership might be the best decision he'd ever made. Unanimous consent for emergency activation, he said finally. What exactly does that involve? A private ceremony that activates the systems without formal council approval, Lyra explained. Legally binding under emergency protocols, but carrying personal liability for all consequences. And emotionally binding, Myra added quietly, in ways that might be difficult to reverse once the crisis is resolved. Because the resonance patterns required for system activation create permanent emotional connections between bonded partners, Zara said. The emergency ceremony doesn't just authorize us to save refugees, it makes us permanently responsible for each other's welfare. Ryan studied their faces, seeing determination mixed with vulnerability that suggested they understood the personal stakes as clearly as the political ones. Well, he said, reaching toward the activation controls, I've never been married before, let alone to three people simultaneously during an interstellar crisis. But I suppose there's no time like the present to learn. As the emergency bonding protocols activated, and the evacuation corridors began their initialization sequence, Ryan realized that his simple liaison assignment had just become something far more complex and infinitely more important than he'd ever imagined possible. The emergency bonding ceremony took place in the heart of the evacuation system itself, a crystalline chamber that pulsed with energies that made Ryan's teeth ache, and his diplomatic training manual seemed completely inadequate for the situation. Around them, corridor initialization sequences painted the walls with light patterns that showed refugee populations already beginning their exodus from danger zones. The traditional vows, Lyra explained as they stood before activation controls that looked like they'd been designed by someone who understood that marriage ceremonies should also double as strategic weapons authorization, have been adapted for emergency circumstances. Essentially, we're promising to share responsibility for 2 million lives, while also committing to personal partnerships that might last significantly longer than either of us originally planned. Significantly longer how? Ryan asked, placing his hand on bioscanners that immediately began analyzing his genetic signature for compatibility with systems that predated human spaceflight. Theavani emergency bonds tend to be permanent, Myra said with a smile that suggested she found his nervousness endearing. The emotional resonance patterns required for evacuation system control create psychological connections that don't fade when the crisis ends. So I'm not just agreeing to help save refugees. I'm agreeing to spend the rest of my life married to three alien women whose cultural expectations I'm still figuring out. Are you having second thoughts? Zara asked, though her tone suggested she was more curious than concerned. Ryan looked around the chamber, noting that the evacuation displays showed transport ships already en route to pickup zones, where millions of displaced people were waiting for salvation that depended on his willingness to accept responsibility for relationships he couldn't fully understand. Second thoughts about the marriage bonds, definitely. Second thoughts about saving 2 million refugees, not a chance. Then perhaps, Lyra said gently, the marriage bonds will prove more compatible than you expect. The ceremony itself combined practical necessity with surprising emotional depth. Ryan's vows to Lyra included promises to support her military strategies, even when they required risks he didn't fully understand. His vows to Myra included commitments to prioritize refugee welfare, even when bureaucratic efficiency suggested abandoning difficult cases. And his vows to Zara included agreements to help develop crystal technology for humanitarian purposes, even when corporate interests offered more profitable alternatives. I promise, Ryan said as the bioscanners confirmed his genetic integration with the evacuation systems, to learn proper pronunciation of Thea-Vani relationship terminology, since apparently being married to 3 alien women involves vocabulary that wasn't covered in my diplomatic language training. The laughter that followed helped ease the tension of performing marriage ceremonies, while watching real-time tactical displays showing hegemony forces advancing toward refugee settlements. And I promise, Lyra replied, to help you understand Thea-Vani military strategy, even when our tactical decisions seem to involve significantly more improvisation and considerably less caution than human military doctrine typically recommends. I promise, Myra added, to explain refugee protection protocols patiently, even when time constraints make comprehensive briefings impossible and emergency decisions require trust in systems you've never seen before. And I promise, Zara concluded, to share crystal technology insights gradually, rather than overwhelming you with technical specifications that involve physics your species hasn't discovered yet, and engineering principles that might give you headaches. The moment the vows concluded, the evacuation corridors activated with energies that transformed the chamber into something resembling the inside of a star. Ryan felt consciousness expanding as the bioresonance patterns linked his awareness to systems that spanned star systems, showing him refugee populations, transport logistics, and evacuation timelines in real-time displays that bypassed his normal sensory processing entirely. The corridors are active, he said, his voice carrying harmonics that suggested the biointegration was affecting his vocal patterns. Transport capacity is incredible. We can relocate entire civilizations. Welcome to Thea-Vani Emergency Management, Myra said, her own voice carrying new harmonics as the bonding process completed. Where crisis response involves technologies that most species can't imagine and responsibilities that span generations. The evacuation proceeded with efficiency that demonstrated why the corridor systems required such stringent safeguards. Within hours, transport ships were carrying refugee populations through space-time shortcuts that reduced journey times from months to minutes, while mobile habitats provided temporary housing that included medical facilities, educational systems, and agricultural capabilities that approached small planetary colonies in their sophistication. 2 million refugees relocated safely, Zara reported 12 hours later as the last transport ships cleared the danger zones. Hegemony forces arrived to find empty settlements and evacuation corridors that had already closed behind our final transports. And the political consequences. Palace Advisor Korath has formally complained about unauthorized use of strategic systems, Lyra replied with satisfaction. But it's difficult to argue against the successful preservation of 2 million lives. Earth Command has expressed official gratitude while privately questioning how one cultural liaison managed to gain control of military systems that they didn't know existed. 6 months later, Ryan found himself reviewing refugee resettlement reports from his office in New Thea-Vani City, the capital of the colony world they'd established for displaced populations who'd chosen to build new lives rather than return to their war-torn homeworlds. Through his window, He could see crystal formations that powered atmospheric processors designed jointly by human and Theovani engineers, creating environments that supported both species, while incorporating agricultural techniques that had transformed refugee settlements into thriving communities. The integration reports are encouraging, Myra said, entering his office with documents that showed refugee populations adapting successfully to their new homes. Displaced families are establishing permanent settlements, and the children are learning both human and Theovani technologies. Any requests for expansion of the corridor network? 17 new applications for evacuation assistance from other refugee populations, Zara confirmed, activating displays that showed crisis zones across the galaxy. Apparently, word has spread that there are evacuation systems that prioritize humanitarian concerns over political considerations. Which means, Lyra added, settling into the chair beside his desk with the comfortable ease that had developed between them over months of shared responsibility. Our emergency marriage bonds have accidentally established a precedent for interspecies humanitarian cooperation that's attracting attention from refugee populations across the galaxy. Ryan leaned back in his chair, which had been designed to accommodate both human and Theovani physiology, and somehow managed to be more comfortable than furniture designed for either species separately. So our hasty wedding ceremony to save 2 million refugees has turned into a full-time career, managing galactic evacuation systems. Our hasty wedding ceremony, Zara corrected with a grin, has turned into the most successful refugee relocation program in recorded history, plus the development of crystal technology that's revolutionizing space travel for peaceful purposes, plus 3 marriages that somehow work better than anyone expected. Speaking of which, Myra said, activating a holographic display that showed the evening's domestic schedule, the children's choir from Settlement 7 is performing tonight, and they specifically requested that all 4 of us attend together. All 4 of us? Apparently, refugee children find the concept of cross-species family structures fascinating rather than confusing, Lyra explained. They've been asking their teachers whether they can have multiple parents from different planets when they grow up. Ryan looked at the 3 women who'd become his wives through emergency necessity and remained his partners through choice, noting how natural their presence in his life had become despite the obvious impossibility of the situation. You know, when I accepted this diplomatic assignment, the most complex relationship challenge I expected to face was remembering not to serve alcohol to species with sulfur-based metabolisms. And now, Myra asked, now I'm trying to figure out how to explain to my parents that I'm married to 3 alien women, responsible for evacuation systems that span 12 star systems, and somehow completely happy with domestic arrangements that definitely weren't covered in any relationship advice I've ever received. Your parents, Zara's luminescent markings shifted to patterns that indicated curiosity. When do we get to meet them? They're arriving next week for the colony's first anniversary celebration. Fair warning, my mother has very strong opinions about proper wedding ceremonies, and she's been planning my hypothetical wedding since I was 12 years old. Will she be disappointed that we skipped the traditional elements? Lyra asked with concern. She'll be disappointed that she missed the ceremony entirely, Ryan replied, though she'll probably be fascinated by Theovani marriage customs once she realizes they involve significantly more practical planning and considerably less decorative excess than human wedding traditions. We could have a formal ceremony, Myra suggested, with proper Theovani traditions and human family participation. The bonds are already permanent, but ceremonies serve social functions beyond legal requirements. A formal wedding ceremony 6 months after the emergency bonding. Why not? Zara said with enthusiasm. We've proven the relationships work under crisis conditions. A celebration that acknowledges the personal aspects alongside the political necessity, seems appropriate. Ryan considered the possibility of explaining to his family that his alien wives wanted to have a formal wedding ceremony to celebrate their successful management of interstellar refugee crises and crystal mining operations. You know what? That actually sounds perfect. Nothing says successful diplomatic mission like marrying 3 alien women twice, once to save the galaxy and once because you actually want to. The formal ceremony took place 3 months later in the Crystal Cathedral of New Theavana, with representatives from dozens of refugee communities alongside Ryan's family, who adapted to the concept of interspecies marriage with the kind of enthusiastic acceptance that suggested they were mainly relieved he'd finally settled down with someone, or in this case, someones, who could keep him out of trouble. "I promise," Ryan said during his revised vows, "to continue learning Theavani domestic traditions, even when they involve complicated meal preparation that requires 3 different atmospheric conditions and crystal resonance tuning for proper digestion." "I promise," Lyra replied, "to explain military contingency planning patiently, even when our defensive strategies require Ryan to understand tactical concepts that human military academies haven't developed yet." "I promise," Myra added, "to share refugee community management techniques, even when the social dynamics involve cultural integration challenges that span multiple species and require diplomatic solutions we're inventing as we go." "And I promise," Zara concluded, "to continue collaborative crystal technology development, even when our engineering projects require Ryan to learn physics that make his atmospheric processing background look like elementary education." As they celebrated with communities they'd helped save and family members who were still adjusting to the concept of galactic-scale domestic arrangements, Ryan reflected on the strange journey from simple liaison officer to husband, refugee coordinator, and accidental expert in interspecies family dynamics. "Any regrets?" Lyra asked later as they stood on their balcony overlooking crystal cities, where refugee children played games that combined human and Theavani cultural elements. "Well," Ryan said, watching transport ships arrive with new refugee populations who'd heard about the evacuation corridors and wanted to build new lives in communities that prioritized cooperation over conflict. "I do miss the days when my biggest relationship challenge was figuring out whether my girlfriend wanted to go to dinner or stay home and watch movies. And now I'm trying to figure out whether my 3 wives want to spend the evening reviewing evacuation system upgrades, attending community cultural performances, or collaborating on crystal technology research that might revolutionize interstellar travel." He paused, considering. "Though I have to admit, the company's much better, and the work is considerably more meaningful than anything I imagined when I thought I was just going to negotiate mining rights. Even with the marriage law complications." "Especially with the marriage law complications," Ryan said, pulling all 3 of them closer as the twin suns of New Theavana set behind crystal formations that powered atmospheric systems designed for multiple species to